Question 1. Market research demonstrates that clients in bankruptcy proceedings may sometimes possess information that, if disclosed, could significantly jeopardize their financial recovery or the success of their bankruptcy plan. An Alabama bankruptcy attorney discovers that their client, a small business owner in Chapter 11 proceedings, has failed to disclose a significant personal asset that could be considered property of the estate under the bankruptcy code. The attorney has a duty to both their client and the court. What is the most ethically sound and legally compliant course of action for the attorney in Alabama? Option A. Advise the client that the asset is not material and should not be disclosed, and if questioned by the court or trustee, the client should deny knowledge of its existence. Option B. File a motion with the bankruptcy court seeking guidance on how to proceed, potentially requesting a protective order or an in-camera review of the asset's details to determine its materiality and the appropriate disclosure requirements. Option C. Advise the client to immediately disclose the asset to the court and the trustee, regardless of the potential negative consequences for the client's case. Option D. Inform the client that the attorney can no longer represent them due to the ethical conflict and withdraw from the case without further action. Correct answer is B. File a motion with the bankruptcy court seeking guidance on how to proceed, potentially requesting a protective order or an in-camera review of the asset's details to determine its materiality and the appropriate disclosure requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Alabama bankruptcy attorney due to the inherent conflict between zealous advocacy for a client and the attorney's duty of candor to the court. The attorney possesses information that, if revealed, could significantly harm the client's case, yet withholding it might constitute a misrepresentation or omission of material fact to the court. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the Alabama rules of professional conduct and the Bankruptcy Code's disclosure requirements, balancing client confidentiality with the integrity of the judicial process. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves seeking guidance from the court and potentially the client while adhering to the attorney's ethical obligations. This approach prioritizes transparency and seeks a judicial resolution to the ethical dilemma. Specifically, the attorney should consider filing a motion for a protective order or seeking an in-camera review by the judge. This allows the court to assess the information's materiality and determine the appropriate course of action, which could include allowing the information to remain undisclosed under specific circumstances or ordering its disclosure. This aligns with Rule 3 of the Alabama Rules of Professional Conduct, which addresses candor toward the tribunal, and the general principles of bankruptcy disclosure under the Bankruptcy Code. The attorney's duty is to the court as well as the client, and this approach seeks to fulfill both obligations by involving the court in the decision-making process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to unilaterally decide to withhold the information without consulting the court or the client. This fails to uphold the duty of candor to the tribunal under Rule 3 of the Alabama Rules of Professional Conduct. If the information is material, withholding it could be considered a misrepresentation by omission, potentially leading to sanctions, dismissal of the case, or disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach is to immediately disclose the information to the court without first exploring protective measures or seeking client consent for disclosure. While this upholds candor, it may violate the attorney's duty of loyalty and confidentiality to the client under Rule 1(6) of the Alabama Rules of Professional Conduct, especially if the information is not strictly required to be disclosed or if less damaging alternatives exist. A third incorrect approach is to advise the client to lie or mislead the court if questioned about the information. This is a direct violation of Rule 3 of the Alabama Rules of Professional Conduct and constitutes suborning perjury, a serious ethical breach with severe consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should first identify the conflicting ethical duties. They should then consult the relevant rules of professional conduct and statutory law. If ambiguity or conflict persists, seeking guidance from the court, a senior partner, or the State Bar Ethics Committee is advisable. The decision-making process should prioritize the integrity of the legal system and the court, while also diligently protecting the client's legitimate interests within the bounds of the law and ethical rules. Question 2. Market research demonstrates that many individuals in Alabama seeking debt relief are unaware of the precise financial thresholds required to qualify for Chapter 13 bankruptcy. A potential client presents with a complex financial situation, and their attorney must determine their eligibility for Chapter 13 relief. Which of the following actions represents the most diligent and legally sound method for the attorney to ascertain the client's eligibility concerning debt limits? Option A. Focus primarily on the client's monthly income and their ability to make payments under a Chapter 13 plan, as this is the most critical factor for eligibility. Option B. Exclude any debts that the attorney subjectively believes are contingent or unliquidated, even without a definitive legal determination, to arrive at a more favorable debt total. Option C. Meticulously calculate the client's total non-contingent, non-liquidated secured and unsecured debts as of the filing date, and compare this sum to the current statutory debt limits for Chapter 13 eligibility as defined by the United States Bankruptcy Code. Option D. Estimate the client's total debt based on a general understanding of typical Chapter 13 debt ceilings, assuming the figures are unlikely to have changed significantly in recent years. The correct answer is C. Meticulously calculate the client's total non-contingent, non-liquidated secured and unsecured debts as of the filing date, and compare this sum to the current statutory debt limits for Chapter 13 eligibility as defined by the United States Bankruptcy Code. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in Alabama Chapter 13 bankruptcy cases, accurately determining eligibility based on debt limits. The professional challenge lies in navigating the specific statutory debt ceilings, which can fluctuate with inflation adjustments, and ensuring the debtor's financial situation aligns precisely with these thresholds. Misinterpreting or misapplying these limits can lead to significant consequences, including dismissal of the bankruptcy petition, loss of the debtor's protection from creditors, and potential professional liability for the attorney. Careful judgment is required to interpret the bankruptcy code and relevant case law as applied to the debtor's unique financial circumstances. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough and precise calculation of the debtor's total non-contingent, non-liquidated secured and unsecured debts as of the date of filing the Chapter 13 petition. This requires meticulously reviewing all financial documentation, including loan statements, credit card balances, and any other evidence of indebtedness. The attorney must then compare this total to the current debt limits established by the United States Bankruptcy Code for Chapter 13 eligibility. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the statutory requirements for Chapter 13 relief in Alabama, as defined by federal law which governs bankruptcy nationwide. The Bankruptcy Code, specifically Section 109(e), sets these limits, and adherence is non-negotiable for filing a valid Chapter 13 case. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely on a general understanding of past debt limits without verifying the most current figures. This is professionally unacceptable because the debt limits are subject to periodic adjustments for inflation, and using outdated figures can lead to a debtor filing under Chapter 13 when they are statutorily ineligible, or conversely, advising a debtor they are ineligible when they now qualify. Another incorrect approach is to exclude certain types of debt from the calculation based on a subjective interpretation of non-contingent or non-liquidated without a clear legal basis. This can result in an inaccurate debt total, potentially leading to a petition being dismissed for failing to meet the debt requirements. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the debtor's income and ability to pay without first confirming the debt limits is also flawed. While income is crucial for confirming a Chapter 13 plan, eligibility for filing Chapter 13 is primarily determined by the debt limitations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic process for assessing Chapter 13 eligibility. This begins with a comprehensive review of the debtor's financial situation, followed by a precise calculation of all relevant debts. Crucially, this calculation must be benchmarked against the most current statutory debt limits as published by the U.S. courts. If the debtor's debts exceed these limits, the professional must then explore alternative bankruptcy chapters, such as Chapter 7, or non-bankruptcy debt resolution strategies, providing clear and informed advice to the client. This methodical approach ensures compliance with the law and protects both the client's interests and the professional's integrity. Question 3. Implementation of a bankruptcy filing for an individual in Alabama who operates a small, unincorporated landscaping business as a sole proprietor, with the majority of their debts stemming from personal living expenses, but also including some business-related equipment loans, presents a challenge in determining the most suitable chapter. What is the most appropriate course of action for the attorney to take? Option A. Conduct a thorough analysis of the debtor's personal financial situation and the nature of their debts to determine if Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 is more appropriate, considering the debts are primarily personal even with some business obligations. Option B. Immediately file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, as the existence of business-related debts necessitates a business reorganization filing. Option C. File for Chapter 7 bankruptcy without further investigation, assuming that the presence of any business debt disqualifies the debtor from Chapter 13. Option D. Advise the debtor that any involvement in self-employment automatically requires a business bankruptcy filing, and proceed with filing the most advantageous business chapter. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough analysis of the debtor's personal financial situation and the nature of their debts to determine if Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 is more appropriate, considering the debts are primarily personal even with some business obligations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a bankruptcy attorney must accurately assess the debtor's situation to determine the most appropriate bankruptcy chapter. Misclassifying an individual as a business, or vice versa, can lead to significant procedural errors, financial disadvantages for the debtor, and potential ethical violations for the attorney. The attorney's judgment is critical in navigating the nuances of Alabama bankruptcy law to ensure the client receives the intended relief. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough investigation into the nature of the debtor's financial affairs and the origin of their debts. This includes meticulously examining the source of income, the purpose of the debts, and whether the entity operates as a sole proprietorship, partnership, corporation, or if the debts are purely personal. If the debts are primarily personal in nature, even if incurred in the course of self-employment or a side business, and the debtor is an individual, Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 is likely appropriate under Alabama bankruptcy law. This approach prioritizes the debtor's individual circumstances and aligns with the intent of individual bankruptcy provisions. Incorrect approach is analysis. Pursuing Chapter 11 bankruptcy solely because the individual has business-related debts, without a comprehensive analysis of whether the individual themselves qualifies as a business for bankruptcy purposes under the Bankruptcy Code as interpreted in Alabama, is an incorrect approach. Chapter 11 is designed for reorganization of businesses, and forcing an individual into this chapter when they are not a business entity can result in unnecessary complexity, higher costs, and a failure to achieve the most efficient debt relief. Another incorrect approach would be to file Chapter 7 for an individual with significant income and a desire to keep assets, when Chapter 13 would be more suitable for a repayment plan and asset retention, thereby failing to advise the client on the most beneficial option available under Alabama law. Finally, assuming that any debt related to self-employment automatically necessitates a business bankruptcy filing, without considering the individual's overall financial picture and the primary nature of their debts, is a flawed assumption that can lead to an improper filing. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centric, fact-driven approach. This involves active listening, diligent information gathering, and a deep understanding of the relevant statutory framework. When faced with a situation that straddles individual and business debt, the professional must conduct a detailed inquiry into the debtor's legal structure, the origin and purpose of the debts, and the debtor's overall financial goals. Consulting the specific provisions of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, as applied in Alabama, and relevant case law is paramount. The ultimate decision should be based on which chapter provides the most effective and appropriate relief for the individual debtor, considering their unique circumstances and the nature of their financial obligations. Question 4. To address the challenge of accurately assessing a debtor's eligibility for Chapter 7 relief under Alabama bankruptcy law, which of the following represents the most prudent and legally compliant strategy when faced with a debtor whose income fluctuates and who has substantial non-discretionary expenses? Option A. Rely on the debtor's assertion of their monthly expenses and income, making reasonable estimations where exact figures are unavailable. quickly determine if they appear to qualify for Chapter 7. Option B. Interpret any ambiguous expense categories in the means test in the manner most beneficial to the debtor to facilitate their desired Chapter 7 filing. Option C. Conduct a meticulous calculation of the debtor's average monthly income over the 6 months preceding the filing date and meticulously apply the means test's allowable deductions for expenses, ensuring each deduction aligns precisely with the statutory definitions and Alabama's specific interpretations. Option D. Focus primarily on the debtor's stated inability to pay their debts, using this as the primary determinant for Chapter 7 eligibility without a detailed means test calculation. The correct answer is C. Conduct a meticulous calculation of the debtor's average monthly income over the 6 months preceding the filing date and meticulously apply the means test's allowable deductions for expenses, ensuring each deduction aligns precisely with the statutory definitions and Alabama's specific interpretations. Explanation: the scenario presents a professional challenge because the debtor's financial situation is complex, with fluctuating income and significant non-discretionary expenses. Accurately determining eligibility for Chapter 7 relief under Alabama's bankruptcy laws requires a meticulous application of the means test, which is designed to prevent abuse of the system by individuals who can afford to repay a portion of their debts. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the bankruptcy code and to uphold the integrity of the bankruptcy process. The best professional approach involves a thorough and accurate calculation of the debtor's income and expenses as defined by the means test, utilizing all available documentation and adhering strictly to the statutory guidelines for Alabama. This includes properly categorizing expenses, accounting for all income sources, and making appropriate adjustments as permitted by law. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the statutory requirements of the means test, ensuring that the debtor's eligibility is assessed based on the objective criteria established by the Bankruptcy Code and interpreted by Alabama courts. This adherence to the law is paramount for ethical practice and to provide sound legal advice. An incorrect approach would be to make assumptions about the debtor's income or expenses without proper verification, or to apply expense categories in a manner inconsistent with the Bankruptcy Code's definitions. This could lead to an inaccurate determination of the debtor's means test results, potentially resulting in improper advice regarding their eligibility for Chapter 7. Such an approach fails to meet the professional standard of diligence and accuracy required in bankruptcy proceedings. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the debtor's stated desire to file Chapter 7 without conducting a comprehensive means test analysis. While a debtor's wishes are important, they do not override the legal requirements for eligibility. Failing to perform the full means test calculation, even if the debtor appears to have limited income, is a regulatory failure. A further incorrect approach would be to interpret ambiguous expense categories in the most favorable light for the debtor without seeking clarification or adhering to established legal interpretations. This can be seen as an attempt to circumvent the spirit of the means test, which aims to distinguish between those who genuinely cannot repay their debts and those who can. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of all financial documentation, a precise application of the means test formulas and definitions as they apply in Alabama, and a clear understanding of the legal presumptions and rebuttals within the means test framework. Professionals must prioritize accuracy and compliance with the Bankruptcy Code above all else, ensuring that their advice is grounded in sound legal principles and ethical conduct. Question 5. The review process indicates that a small business owner in Birmingham, Alabama, is experiencing significant financial distress due to a downturn in the local economy and is seeking to restructure their debts while continuing operations. They have substantial assets, including real estate and inventory, and a complex web of secured and unsecured creditors. Which type of bankruptcy relief is most likely to be appropriate for this debtor under Alabama bankruptcy law? Option A, Chapter 7 bankruptcy for a quick liquidation of assets to satisfy creditors. Option B, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, allowing for the reorganization of debts and continued business operations. Option C, a hybrid approach combining elements of Chapter 7 and Chapter 13. Option D, Chapter 13 bankruptcy, to propose a repayment plan over 3 to 5 years. The correct answer is B, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, allowing for the reorganization of debts and continued business operations. Explanation. The review process indicates a scenario professionally challenging due to the need to accurately assess a debtor's financial situation and guide them toward the most appropriate bankruptcy relief under Alabama law. Mischaracterizing the type of bankruptcy can lead to significant adverse consequences for the debtor, including loss of assets, prolonged financial distress, and potential dismissal of their case. Careful judgment is required to align the debtor's goals and circumstances with the specific provisions of the Bankruptcy Code as applied in Alabama. The best professional approach involves a thorough analysis of the debtor's income, expenses, assets, and liabilities, coupled with a clear understanding of their objectives. This approach prioritizes identifying whether the debtor's primary goal is liquidation of assets to discharge debts, Chapter 7, reorganization of a business or complex individual debt structure, Chapter 11, or a structured repayment plan for individuals with regular income, Chapter 13. By meticulously evaluating these factors against the eligibility requirements and operational frameworks of each chapter, a legal professional can accurately advise the debtor on the most suitable path. This aligns with the ethical duty to provide competent representation and the legal requirement to file under the correct chapter to ensure the debtor receives the intended relief. An incorrect approach would be to recommend Chapter 7 solely because it offers the quickest debt discharge, without first verifying the debtor's eligibility based on their income and asset levels under the Alabama means test provisions. This failure to conduct a proper eligibility assessment could result in a case being dismissed, leaving the debtor in a worse financial position and potentially facing additional costs. Another incorrect approach would be to suggest Chapter 11 for an individual with a modest income and no complex business operations, simply because it offers more flexibility in restructuring debt. This overlooks the significantly higher costs, complexity, and procedural burdens associated with Chapter 11, which are generally not appropriate or beneficial for such individuals, potentially leading to unnecessary financial strain and case failure. Finally, advising Chapter 13 without confirming the debtor has sufficient regular income to fund a repayment plan would be professionally unsound. Chapter 13 is fundamentally a repayment chapter, and if the debtor cannot demonstrate the capacity to make plan payments, the case is unlikely to be confirmed and will likely be dismissed, failing to provide the intended relief. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive client intake, followed by a detailed financial assessment. This assessment must then be cross-referenced with the specific eligibility criteria and operational characteristics of each relevant bankruptcy chapter under the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, as interpreted and applied within Alabama. The final recommendation should be based on a holistic understanding of the debtor's situation and their stated goals, ensuring the chosen chapter provides the most effective and appropriate legal remedy. Question 6. Examination of the data shows that in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy case filed in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama, the trustee has reviewed the debtor's schedules and statements of financial affairs. The trustee has identified significant discrepancies and omissions that strongly suggest the debtor may have engaged in fraudulent conduct to conceal assets and incur debts under false pretenses. The trustee believes certain debts may be non-dischargeable due to this alleged fraud. What is the most appropriate course of action for the trustee to take under the federal rules of bankruptcy procedure? Option A. File a motion with the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama to object to the discharge of specific debts, supported by evidence demonstrating the debtor's fraudulent intent or other grounds for denial of discharge under 11 U.S.C. Section 727. Option B. Inform the creditors that, based on the trustee's review, the debts are likely not dischargeable and that they will not be paid from the bankruptcy estate. Option C. Proceed with the administration of the estate as if the debtor's representations are accurate, without further investigation into the alleged fraud. Option D. Advise the creditors to file their own individual lawsuits in state court to recover the alleged fraudulent debts. The correct answer is A. File a motion with the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama to object to the discharge of specific debts, supported by evidence demonstrating the debtor's fraudulent intent or other grounds for denial of discharge under 11 U.S.C. Section 727. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a debtor's desire for a fresh start and the rights of creditors to receive fair treatment under the Bankruptcy Code and the Federal Rules of Bankruptcy Procedure, FRBP. The trustee's duty is to administer the estate impartially, which requires adherence to procedural rules to ensure fairness and transparency for all parties involved. Careful judgment is required to navigate the procedural requirements of the FRBP while balancing the interests of the debtor and creditors. The correct approach involves the trustee diligently reviewing the debtor's proposed schedules and statements, comparing them against available documentation and information, and then filing a motion with the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama to object to the discharge of specific debts, supported by evidence demonstrating the debtor's fraudulent intent or other grounds for denial of discharge under 11 U.S.C. Section 727. This approach is correct because it directly utilizes the procedural mechanisms provided by the FRBP, specifically Rule 7001, et seq. For adversary proceedings, which are initiated by complaint and govern dischargeability issues, and the Bankruptcy Code to address the alleged fraud. The trustee's role is to investigate and pursue claims on behalf of the estate, and filing a timely objection with the court is the prescribed method for challenging a debtor's discharge based on fraudulent conduct. This ensures due process for the debtor and allows the court to make a determination based on presented evidence. An incorrect approach would be for the trustee to unilaterally decide that the debts are not dischargeable based on the initial review and simply inform the creditors that they will not be paid. This is procedurally flawed because the FRBP mandates a formal process for determining dischargeability, typically through an adversary proceeding. The trustee lacks the authority to make such a determination independently. It rests with the court. Informing creditors without initiating the proper legal action deprives the debtor of their right to due process and fails to uphold the trustee's fiduciary duty to administer the estate according to established legal procedures. Another incorrect approach would be for the trustee to advise the creditors to file their own individual lawsuits in state court to recover the alleged fraudulent debts. This is incorrect because the bankruptcy estate has exclusive jurisdiction over claims against the debtor's assets. Directing creditors to state court bypasses the bankruptcy court's authority and the trustee's responsibility to administer the estate for the benefit of all creditors. Furthermore, it would likely result in inconsistent outcomes and administrative inefficiency, undermining the purpose of the bankruptcy process. A final incorrect approach would be for the trustee to ignore the suspicious information and proceed with the administration of the estate as if no fraud occurred, assuming the debtor's representations are accurate. This is professionally unacceptable as it abdicates the trustee's duty to investigate potential misconduct and to protect the integrity of the bankruptcy process. Failing to act on credible evidence of fraud would be a breach of fiduciary duty and a violation of the FRBP implicit requirement for diligent administration of the estate. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the FRBP and the Bankruptcy Code. When suspicious information arises, the trustee must first assess the credibility and materiality of the information. If it suggests potential fraud or other grounds for objection, the trustee should consult relevant legal counsel and then initiate the appropriate procedural steps within the bankruptcy court, such as filing a motion or commencing an adversary proceeding, to allow the court to adjudicate the matter. This ensures that all actions are taken within the bounds of the law and with due respect for the rights of all parties. Question 7. Upon reviewing the financial distress of a business client in Alabama, a creditor discovers a significant outstanding debt. The creditor recalls a verbal agreement with the debtor confirming the debt's existence and amount, but no formal written contract was ever executed for this specific obligation. The creditor wishes to ensure they are recognized and can recover as much of this debt as possible within the upcoming Alabama bankruptcy proceedings. What is the most appropriate course of action for the creditor? Option A. Immediately contact the debtor directly to arrange a payment plan outside of the bankruptcy court to secure repayment of the debt. Option B. Rely on the verbal agreement with the debtor and await notification from the bankruptcy court regarding any claims process, assuming the debtor will list the debt. Option C. Submit a detailed affidavit to the bankruptcy court outlining the verbal agreement and the creditor's understanding of the debt's terms, without filing a formal proof of claim. Option D. File a formal proof of claim with the bankruptcy court, attaching any available supporting documentation, even if it does not include a signed written contract for the specific debt. Correct answer is D. File a formal proof of claim with the bankruptcy court, attaching any available supporting documentation, even if it does not include a signed written contract for the specific debt. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a creditor's desire to maximize recovery and the legal framework governing bankruptcy proceedings in Alabama. A creditor must navigate the complex rules of claim filing and potential objections while upholding ethical obligations and adhering strictly to the bankruptcy code as interpreted by Alabama courts. Careful judgment is required to balance aggressive pursuit of legitimate claims with the procedural requirements and the rights of other parties in the bankruptcy estate. The correct approach involves meticulously preparing and filing the proof of claim within the statutory deadlines, ensuring all required documentation is attached and that the claim accurately reflects the debt owed. This includes understanding the specific requirements for different types of claims under Alabama bankruptcy law, such as secured, unsecured, or priority claims. By adhering to these procedural mandates, the creditor acts within the bounds of the law, preserving their right to participate in the distribution of the debtor's assets. This approach is legally sound and ethically responsible, as it respects the established legal process and provides transparency to the bankruptcy court and other stakeholders. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a verbal agreement with the debtor regarding the debt is sufficient to establish a claim without formal filing. Alabama bankruptcy law, like federal bankruptcy law, requires a formal proof of claim to be filed with the court. Relying solely on a verbal understanding ignores this critical procedural requirement, likely resulting in the claim being disallowed. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to collect the debt outside of the bankruptcy process after the petition has been filed. This constitutes an illegal act, known as a violation of the automatic stay, and can lead to severe sanctions from the court. A further incorrect approach would be to misrepresent the nature or amount of the debt in the proof of claim. Such misrepresentation is a form of fraud and can have serious legal and ethical consequences, including the disallowance of the entire claim and potential criminal charges. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding and strict adherence to the relevant legal framework. In this case, Alabama bankruptcy law. This involves thorough research of the bankruptcy code and relevant case law, meticulous attention to procedural deadlines and requirements, and a commitment to honesty and transparency in all dealings with the court and other parties. When faced with ambiguity, seeking legal counsel specializing in Alabama bankruptcy law is a prudent step to ensure compliance and protect the creditor's interests appropriately. Question 8. When evaluating the claims of creditors in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy case filed in Alabama, what is the most appropriate method for determining the classification of a creditor's claim as either secured or unsecured? Option A. Assume all creditors who have provided goods or services on credit are unsecured unless they explicitly state otherwise in their invoices. Option B. Thoroughly review all loan documents, security agreements, and evidence of perfection of any claimed security interest under Alabama law to ascertain if a valid and enforceable lien exists on specific collateral securing the debt. Option C. Classify a creditor as secured if they have a written agreement with the debtor that mentions the possibility of collateral, regardless of whether a security interest was ever perfected. Option D. Treat the entire amount of any debt where collateral is mentioned as secured, even if the value of the collateral is demonstrably less than the total debt owed. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly review all loan documents, security agreements, and evidence of perfection of any claimed security interest under Alabama law to ascertain if a valid and enforceable lien exists on specific collateral securing the debt. Explanation: when evaluating the rights of creditors in an Alabama bankruptcy proceeding, understanding the distinction between secured and unsecured creditors is paramount. This scenario is professionally challenging because a debtor's assets may be encumbered by various claims, and mischaracterizing a creditor's status can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for the debtor, the creditor, and the bankruptcy estate. Incorrectly treating a secured creditor as unsecured could deprive them of their collateral, while improperly classifying an unsecured debt as secured could unfairly diminish the recovery for other unsecured creditors. Careful judgment is required to accurately assess the nature of each debt and the rights associated with it under Alabama law and the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. The best professional approach involves meticulously examining the documentation establishing the debt and any purported security interest. This includes reviewing loan agreements, security agreements, financing statements, UCC-1 filings, and any other instruments that evidence the creation and perfection of a security interest in specific collateral. If a creditor holds a valid, perfected security interest in collateral that secures their debt, they are a secured creditor to the extent of the value of that collateral. Under the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, particularly sections like 11 U.S. Code Section 506, secured creditors have a right to the value of their collateral, and their claims are treated differently from unsecured claims. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the legal definitions and requirements for establishing secured status, ensuring that creditors receive the rights to which they are legally entitled based on their prior agreements and the proper perfection of their security interests. An incorrect approach would be to assume a creditor is unsecured simply because they are a trade vendor or have a contractual relationship with the debtor that does not explicitly mention collateral. This fails to account for the possibility of a purchase, money security interest, or other forms of collateral that may not be immediately obvious from the nature of the business relationship. Ethically and legally, this is unacceptable as it ignores the potential for a creditor to have a valid secured claim that has been properly perfected. Another incorrect approach is to classify a creditor as secured based solely on a general statement in a contract that the debtor grants a security interest without evidence of perfection. Perfection is a critical step in establishing priority and is governed by Alabama law, often through Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code as adopted in Alabama. Without proper perfection, the creditor may only hold an unsecured claim, or their secured claim may be subordinate to other perfected interests. Failing to verify perfection is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. A third incorrect approach is to treat all debts arising from a single transaction as entirely secured, even if the debt exceeds the value of the collateral. Section 506A of the Bankruptcy Code bifurcates undersecured claims into a secured portion, up to the value of the collateral, and an unsecured portion, for the remainder. Ignoring this bifurcation and treating the entire debt as secured is a misapplication of bankruptcy law. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should begin with a thorough review of all relevant documentation for each creditor. This involves identifying the nature of the debt, the terms of the agreement, and critically, any evidence of a security interest and its perfection under Alabama law. If a security interest is claimed, the next step is to verify its perfection by searching relevant public records, such as UCC filings with the Alabama Secretary of State. The value of the collateral must also be assessed to determine if the claim is fully secured, undersecured, or potentially oversecured. This systematic, evidence-based approach ensures compliance with the Bankruptcy Code and Alabama law, protecting the integrity of the bankruptcy process and the rights of all parties involved. Question 9. The analysis reveals that a business client in Alabama is experiencing significant financial distress, with mounting debts and an inability to meet payment obligations. While the client is considering their options, they are hesitant about the perceived stigma of filing for bankruptcy. A creditor has also recently indicated an intent to pursue legal action to recover outstanding debts. Considering these circumstances, what is the most appropriate course of action to advise the client regarding the initiation of bankruptcy proceedings? Option A. Recommend that the client pursue an involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy, filing as a means to address their financial distress. Option B. Advise the client on the strategic benefits of initiating a voluntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy, filing to maintain control over the process and proactively address their financial situation. Option C. Inform the client that the difference between voluntary and involuntary bankruptcy is minimal and they can proceed with either option. Option D. Suggest that the client simply wait for creditors to file an involuntary petition against them to resolve their financial issues. The correct answer is B. Advise the client on the strategic benefits of initiating a voluntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy, filing to maintain control over the process, and proactively address their financial situation. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent tension between a debtor's desire to control the bankruptcy process and the potential for creditors to initiate proceedings when a debtor is demonstrably unable to meet financial obligations. Careful judgment is required to navigate the distinct legal and strategic implications of each filing type under Alabama bankruptcy law. The approach that represents best professional practice involves advising the client on the strategic advantages of a voluntary Chapter 7 filing. This is correct because a voluntary filing under Chapter 7 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, as applied in Alabama, allows the debtor to initiate the process, select the appropriate chapter, and maintain a degree of control over the proceedings. It provides a structured and predictable path for liquidation and discharge, often leading to a more favorable outcome for the debtor compared to the potential disruption and stigma of an involuntary petition. The Bankruptcy Code encourages voluntary filings by providing clear procedures and allowing debtors to proactively address their financial distress. An incorrect approach would be to advise the client that an involuntary Chapter 7 filing is a viable and preferable option for a debtor seeking to resolve their financial difficulties. This is professionally unacceptable because involuntary petitions are designed for creditors to force a debtor into bankruptcy when the debtor is failing to pay debts. A debtor cannot initiate an involuntary petition against themselves. Attempting to do so would be a misrepresentation of the law and could lead to sanctions. Another incorrect approach would be to suggest that the distinction between voluntary and involuntary bankruptcy is merely procedural and has no significant impact on the debtor's rights or the outcome of the case. This is professionally unacceptable as it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of bankruptcy law. The choice of filing type has profound implications for control, timing, disclosure requirements, and the debtor's ability to shape the narrative of their financial distress. Ignoring these differences is a serious ethical and legal failing. Finally, advising the client to simply wait for creditors to file an involuntary petition without exploring voluntary options is also an incorrect approach. This is professionally unacceptable because it abdicates the professional responsibility to provide proactive and informed counsel. It leaves the debtor vulnerable to the creditor's agenda, potentially resulting in a less favorable outcome and foregoing the strategic benefits of a controlled voluntary filing. The professional reasoning framework for similar situations should involve a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, their objectives, and the potential actions of their creditors. Professionals must then clearly articulate the legal and strategic differences between voluntary and involuntary bankruptcy, explaining the advantages and disadvantages of each in the context of Alabama bankruptcy law. The ultimate recommendation should be based on what best serves the client's interests, while adhering strictly to the letter and spirit of the Bankruptcy Code. Question 10. Comparative studies suggest that accurately assessing a debtor's eligibility for Chapter 7 bankruptcy relief in Alabama hinges on a precise calculation of their income relative to the state's median. If a debtor in Birmingham, Alabama, has a household of 4 and their verifiable income over the past 6 months, after accounting for certain allowed deductions, averages $500 per month, and the current median monthly income for a family of 4 in Alabama is $200, what is the most appropriate initial determination regarding their eligibility for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, assuming no other disqualifying factors are present? Option A. The debtor's eligibility cannot be determined without a full audit of all their financial transactions over the past 2 years. Option B. The debtor presumptively qualifies for Chapter 7 bankruptcy relief because their average monthly income is below the national median income for their household size. Option C. The debtor likely does not qualify for Chapter 7 bankruptcy relief and should be advised to consider Chapter 13, as their income exceeds the Alabama median income for their household size. Option D. The debtor presumptively qualifies for Chapter 7 bankruptcy relief because their average monthly income is below the Alabama median income for their household size. The correct answer is D. The debtor presumptively qualifies for Chapter 7 bankruptcy relief because their average monthly income is below the Alabama median income for their household size. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a precise application of Alabama's bankruptcy eligibility rules, specifically the means test, which involves complex income calculations and comparisons to state median income. Misinterpreting or miscalculating these figures can lead to a debtor being ineligible for Chapter 7 relief, forcing them into a Chapter 13 repayment plan, or potentially no bankruptcy relief at all. Careful judgment is required to ensure all income sources are accurately accounted for and that the correct median income figures for Alabama are used. The best professional approach involves a meticulous calculation of the debtor's current monthly income, CMI, as defined by the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act of 2005, BAPPA, and comparing it to the median income for a household of similar size in Alabama. This calculation must include all verifiable income sources, such as wages, self-employment income, and any other forms of regular income, after deducting allowed expenses as per the Bankruptcy Code. If the calculated CMI, after deductions, is below the applicable Alabama median income, the debtor presumptively passes the means test for Chapter 7. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the statutory requirements of 11 U.S. Code Section 707B and the Alabama-specific median income data published by the Executive Office for United States Trustees. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the debtor's stated disposable income without performing the detailed CMI calculation and comparison to the Alabama median. This fails to comply with the BAPPA mandate for a structured means test, potentially overlooking income that should be included or mischaracterizing the debtor's financial situation. Another incorrect approach is to use the median income figures from a different state or a generic national average, as Alabama has its own specific median income data that must be used for eligibility determination under federal bankruptcy law. This violates the jurisdictional specificity required by the Bankruptcy Code. Finally, an approach that excludes certain income sources without a clear statutory basis for exclusion, such as irregular or non-recurring income that is still considered part of the debtor's income for means test purposes, would also be incorrect. This misrepresents the debtor's true income capacity and can lead to an inaccurate eligibility assessment. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Thoroughly understanding the client's income and expense situation. 2. Identifying all relevant income sources for the means test calculation. 3. Obtaining the most current and accurate Alabama median income data for the debtor's household size. 4. Performing the CMI calculation precisely according to the Bankruptcy Code. 5. Comparing the calculated CMI to the Alabama median income to determine presumptive eligibility for Chapter 7. 6. Documenting all calculations and data sources meticulously. Question 11. The investigation demonstrates that a creditor in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy case pending in the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama intends to file a motion for relief from the automatic stay. The creditor's counsel has drafted a motion that fully complies with the federal rules of bankruptcy procedure and includes all necessary substantive legal arguments. However, counsel is unsure if any specific local rules of the Northern District of Alabama might impose additional requirements beyond the federal rules. Which of the following approaches best ensures the motion will be procedurally sound and considered by the court? Option A. Utilize a standard template motion for relief from stay that has been successfully used in other federal bankruptcy courts, assuming it will be acceptable in the Northern District of Alabama. Option B. Focus exclusively on strengthening the substantive legal arguments within the motion, as the court will prioritize the merits of the creditor's claim over minor procedural technicalities related to local rules. Option C. Thoroughly review the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama's local rules for any specific requirements pertaining to motions for relief from stay, and ensure the drafted motion meets all such local mandates in addition to federal requirements. Option D. Proceed with filing the motion as drafted, relying solely on the federal rules of bankruptcy procedure, as these are the primary governing rules for all bankruptcy proceedings. Correct answer is C. Thoroughly review the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama's local rules for any specific requirements pertaining to motions for relief from stay, and ensure the drafted motion meets all such local mandates in addition to federal requirements. Explanation. The investigation demonstrates a common challenge in bankruptcy practice, navigating the interplay between federal bankruptcy law and local court rules. In Alabama, as in many federal judicial districts, the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama has specific local rules that supplement the federal rules of bankruptcy procedure. These local rules often address procedural details, filing requirements, and deadlines that are not exhaustively covered by federal rules. Failure to adhere to these local rules can lead to significant procedural errors, including dismissal of a case or rejection of filings, even if the filings comply with federal mandates. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires practitioners to possess not only a strong understanding of federal bankruptcy law, but also meticulous attention to the specific procedural requirements of the local jurisdiction. The best approach involves a thorough review of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama's local rules concerning the filing of motions for relief from stay. This approach is correct because the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, while providing the framework for bankruptcy proceedings, explicitly allows for local rules to govern procedural matters within each district. The local rules for the Northern District of Alabama, specifically Rule 4001-1, detail the precise requirements for filing a motion for relief from stay, including notice periods, service requirements, and the form of the motion itself. Adhering to these specific local rules ensures that the motion is properly filed, timely served, and legally sufficient under the court's procedural mandates, thereby increasing the likelihood of a favorable ruling and avoiding procedural objections. An approach that solely relies on the federal rules of bankruptcy procedure without consulting the local rules for the Northern District of Alabama is incorrect. This failure constitutes a violation of the court's procedural authority, as the local rules are binding on all parties practicing before that court. The federal rules of bankruptcy procedure are a baseline, and local rules often add further specificity or requirements. Ignoring these local mandates can lead to a motion being deemed procedurally deficient, even if it technically meets federal standards. Another incorrect approach is to assume that a standard template motion for relief from stay, used in other jurisdictions, will automatically comply with the local rules of the Northern District of Alabama. Each district's local rules can have unique requirements regarding content, formatting, exhibits, or even the specific language used in certain pleadings. Relying on a generic template without verifying its compliance with the specific local rules of the Northern District of Alabama risks overlooking critical procedural steps, leading to the motion being rejected or contested on procedural grounds. Finally, an approach that prioritizes the substantive legal arguments for relief from stay over procedural compliance with local rules is also professionally unacceptable. While the merits of the motion are crucial, procedural compliance is a prerequisite for the court to even consider those merits. A motion that is procedurally flawed due to non-compliance with the Northern District of Alabama's local rules may be dismissed before the court can evaluate the underlying legal arguments, rendering the substantive analysis moot. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the relevant federal bankruptcy law. Second, immediately consult the specific local rules of the bankruptcy court where the case is pending. Third, compare the requirements of the local rules with the federal rules and any applicable forms. Fourth, draft or adapt pleadings and motions to ensure full compliance with both federal and local procedural mandates. And fifth, verify compliance before filing. Question 12. Analysis of bankruptcy trustee's actions in Alabama. A trustee appointed in an Alabama Chapter 7 bankruptcy case discovers a potentially valuable but complex piece of intellectual property owned by the debtor that was not disclosed on the initial schedules. The trustee has a personal acquaintance who is an expert in this specific field and has expressed interest in acquiring such assets. What is the most appropriate course of action for the trustee to ensure the proper administration of the bankruptcy estate and uphold their fiduciary responsibilities? Option A. Ignore the intellectual property as it was not disclosed by the debtor, assuming it is of little value or too complicated to pursue, thereby avoiding potential complications. Option B. Immediately offer the intellectual property to the personal acquaintance at a price that seems reasonable to the trustee, given the acquaintance's expertise, to expedite the liquidation of this asset. Option C. Conduct a thorough investigation into the intellectual property's value, obtain an independent appraisal, and then solicit competitive bids from interested parties, including the personal acquaintance, ensuring full transparency and court oversight for any sale. Option D. Use estate funds to invest in developing the intellectual property further, hoping to increase its value before attempting a sale, without seeking court approval for this speculative investment. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough investigation into the intellectual property's value, obtain an independent appraisal, and then solicit competitive bids from interested parties, including the personal acquaintance, ensuring full transparency and court oversight for any sale. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a bankruptcy trustee in Alabama due to the inherent conflict between the trustee's duty to maximize the value of the bankruptcy estate for creditors and the potential for personal gain or preferential treatment. The trustee must navigate these competing interests with utmost integrity and adherence to the bankruptcy code and Alabama-specific practices, ensuring transparency and fairness throughout the process. The trustee's actions directly impact the financial well-being of the debtor and the recovery prospects of numerous creditors, demanding a high degree of diligence and ethical conduct. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the trustee diligently investigating all potential assets of the bankruptcy estate, including any undisclosed or potentially undervalued assets, and then pursuing their liquidation in a manner that yields the highest possible return for the benefit of all creditors. This includes conducting thorough due diligence, obtaining independent appraisals when necessary, and seeking court approval for significant transactions, all while maintaining strict impartiality and avoiding any appearance of impropriety. This approach aligns with the trustee's fundamental fiduciary duty under the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, specifically 11 U.S.C. Section 704, to collect and reduce to money the property of the estate and close the estate as expeditiously as is compatible with the best interests of the parties in interest. The trustee's role is to act as a neutral administrator for the benefit of the creditor body, not to engage in speculative ventures or personal enrichment. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves the trustee prioritizing the sale of a potentially undervalued asset to a close associate or entity with whom the trustee has a pre-existing relationship, without conducting a comprehensive market analysis or seeking competitive bids. This action creates a significant appearance of impropriety and a conflict of interest, violating the trustee's duty of loyalty and impartiality. Such conduct could lead to allegations of self-dealing or preferential treatment, undermining the integrity of the bankruptcy process and potentially resulting in personal liability for the trustee. Another incorrect approach is for the trustee to overlook or fail to investigate a significant undisclosed asset, such as a valuable intellectual property, right, or a dormant but potentially lucrative business interest, due to a lack of personal interest or perceived complexity. This failure to diligently administer the estate and maximize its value directly contravenes the trustee's statutory obligations under 11 U.S.C. Section 704 to administer the estate efficiently and for the benefit of creditors. It exposes the trustee to potential surcharge or removal for negligence or breach of fiduciary duty. A third incorrect approach involves the trustee using estate funds for personal expenses or speculative investments that are not directly related to the administration or liquidation of estate assets, even if the intention is to generate additional funds for creditors. This constitutes a clear misappropriation of estate funds and a breach of fiduciary duty, exposing the trustee to severe legal and ethical repercussions, including criminal charges and civil penalties. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must adopt a decision-making framework centered on the principles of fiduciary duty, transparency, and adherence to statutory mandates. This involves a proactive approach to asset identification and valuation, a commitment to fair and competitive liquidation processes, and an unwavering avoidance of conflicts of interest. When faced with complex assets or potential conflicts, trustees should err on the side of caution, seeking court guidance and expert advice to ensure all actions are legally sound and ethically defensible, thereby upholding the trust placed in them by the court and the parties involved in the bankruptcy proceedings. Question 13. Consider a scenario in Alabama where a debtor in Chapter 11 bankruptcy seeks court approval to continue using essential equipment that serves as collateral for a secured loan. The debtor's motion proposes no specific measures to compensate the secured lender for the potential depreciation or loss of value of the equipment during its continued use. What is the most appropriate course of action for the secured lender under the Alabama Bankruptcy Law framework? Option A. Passively accept the debtor's proposal, assuming the court will automatically safeguard the lender's interests without any specific action. Option B. Assert rights based solely on the terms of the original security agreement, disregarding the bankruptcy court's jurisdiction. Option C. Formally object to the debtor's motion and request the court to order adequate protection as required by Section 361 of the Bankruptcy Code, specifying the form of protection sought. Option D. Immediately file a motion seeking the abandonment of the collateral, by the bankruptcy estate? The correct answer is C. Formally object to the debtor's motion and request the court to order adequate protection as required by Section 361 of the Bankruptcy Code, specifying the form of protection sought. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a thorough understanding of the Bankruptcy Code's provisions regarding the treatment of secured claims, specifically the concept of adequate protection under Section 361. Misinterpreting these provisions can lead to significant financial harm to the secured creditor and potential violations of the Bankruptcy Code, impacting the debtor's reorganization efforts and the integrity of the bankruptcy process in Alabama. Careful judgment is required to balance the debtor's need for continued use of collateral with the secured creditor's constitutional and statutory rights. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves diligently analyzing Section 361 of the Bankruptcy Code, which outlines the requirements for adequate protection. This section mandates that the court must provide adequate protection to a secured creditor whose interest in property is subject to the debtor's use, sale, or lease. Adequate protection can take various forms, such as periodic cash payments, additional or replacement lien, or other relief that will result in the realization of the value of the creditor's interest in the property. In this case, the debtor's proposal to simply continue using the equipment without any compensatory measures fails to meet the statutory definition of adequate protection. The creditor is entitled to protection against the decline in value of their collateral. Therefore, the creditor should formally object to the debtor's motion and request the court to order adequate protection as required by Section 361, specifying the form of protection they deem appropriate, such as periodic payments to cover depreciation and interest. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to passively accept the debtor's proposal without objection, assuming the court will automatically protect the creditor's interests. This fails to acknowledge the affirmative duty placed upon the debtor and the court by Section 361 to provide adequate protection. By not objecting, the creditor waives their right to demand such protection and risks the erosion of their collateral's value without recourse. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately seek abandonment of the collateral. While abandonment is a remedy available in bankruptcy, it is typically considered when the collateral is burdensome or has no equity for the estate. In this scenario, the equipment is essential for the debtor's reorganization, and the creditor's primary concern is the protection of their secured interest, not necessarily the immediate return of the collateral. Suing abandonment prematurely bypasses the statutory framework for adequate protection and may not be the most beneficial outcome for the creditor if the debtor can provide such protection. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on general principles of contract law to assert rights over the collateral. While the security agreement is the foundation of the creditor's rights, bankruptcy proceedings operate under a distinct statutory framework. The Bankruptcy Code, specifically Section 361, dictates the procedures and requirements for protecting secured creditors' interests during the bankruptcy case. Ignoring these specific bankruptcy provisions and attempting to enforce rights as if in a non-bankruptcy context is a fundamental error. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should first identify the specific bankruptcy provisions relevant to their client's position. In this case, recognizing the importance of Section 361 is paramount. They should then analyze the debtor's proposed actions against the requirements of that section. A critical step is to understand the concept of adequate protection and its various forms. Professionals must then formulate a strategy that aligns with the Bankruptcy Code, which often involves formal objections and specific requests to the court for relief that satisfies the statutory mandates. Proactive engagement with the court and adherence to the procedural rules of the Bankruptcy Code are essential for protecting client interests. Question 14. During the evaluation of a client's financial distress in Alabama, which of the following best describes the fundamental definition and purpose of filing for bankruptcy? Option A. To enable debtors to retain all their assets while simultaneously discharging their outstanding debts. Option B. To facilitate the restructuring and repayment of debts over an extended period through a court-supervised plan. Option C. To serve as a punitive measure against creditors for perceived unfair lending practices. Option D. To provide a legal framework for the orderly liquidation of a debtor's non-exempt assets to satisfy creditors, thereby offering a fresh start. Correct answer is D. To provide a legal framework for the orderly liquidation of a debtor's non-exempt assets to satisfy creditors, thereby offering a fresh start. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a thorough understanding of the fundamental purpose of bankruptcy proceedings under Alabama law, specifically distinguishing between the goals of liquidation and reorganization. Misinterpreting this purpose can lead to incorrect advice, potentially harming the client's financial interests and violating professional duties. Careful judgment is required to align the client's objectives with the appropriate bankruptcy chapter and its underlying principles. The best approach involves accurately identifying the client's primary goal as debt relief through the orderly liquidation of non-exempt assets to satisfy creditors, which aligns with the core definition and purpose of Chapter 7 bankruptcy in Alabama. This approach is correct because Chapter 7 is designed for individuals or businesses that cannot afford to repay their debts and seek a fresh start by discharging their obligations after surrendering non-exempt property. The Bankruptcy Code, as applied in Alabama, clearly delineates this purpose, aiming to provide debtors with a discharge of debts while ensuring a fair distribution to creditors from available assets. An incorrect approach would be to advise the client that Chapter 7 bankruptcy is primarily intended to allow them to keep all their assets while discharging debts. This is fundamentally flawed as Chapter 7 involves the liquidation of non-exempt assets. Another incorrect approach would be to suggest that Chapter 7 is designed to restructure and repay debts over time. This mischaracterizes the purpose of Chapter 7 and conflates it with the objectives of Chapter 13 or Chapter 11, which are focused on repayment plans. Finally, advising the client that the primary purpose of bankruptcy is to punish creditors for unfair lending practices misunderstands the rehabilitative and equitable distribution goals of the Bankruptcy Code. Professionals should approach such situations by first conducting a comprehensive client interview to understand their financial situation, goals, and priorities. They must then consult the relevant provisions of the United States Bankruptcy Code and any applicable Alabama state laws or local rules to determine which chapter best serves the client's stated objectives. The decision-making process should prioritize educating the client about the true nature and consequences of each bankruptcy chapter, ensuring informed consent and alignment with legal realities. Question 15. Research into the historical development of bankruptcy law in the United States reveals a significant shift in its underlying philosophy. Considering the application of this law in Alabama, which of the following best reflects the impact of this historical evolution on contemporary bankruptcy proceedings? Option A. The historical shift from a purely punitive, creditor-focused model to one that emphasizes debtor rehabilitation and a fresh start is a foundational principle that continues to shape the interpretation and application of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code in Alabama. Option B. Early English bankruptcy statutes, primarily focused on the punishment of fraudulent debtors, provide the most direct and relevant framework for understanding modern bankruptcy claims in Alabama. Option C. The historical development of bankruptcy law is largely an academic exercise, with little practical bearing on the day-to-day application of the current U.S. Bankruptcy Code in Alabama courts. Option D. The historical development of bankruptcy law is best understood by examining isolated instances of insolvency in ancient civilizations, as these provide universal principles applicable to contemporary Alabama bankruptcy cases. The correct answer is A. The historical shift from a purely punitive, creditor-focused model to one that emphasizes debtor rehabilitation and a fresh start is a foundational principle that continues to shape the interpretation and application of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code in Alabama. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of how foundational legal principles evolve and impact current practice. A bankruptcy attorney in Alabama must not only grasp the current bankruptcy code, but also appreciate the historical context that shaped its provisions, particularly concerning the treatment of debtors and creditors. This historical perspective is crucial for interpreting ambiguous statutory language, understanding legislative intent, and advising clients on the long-term implications of different legal strategies. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between historical curiosities and legally significant developments that continue to influence Alabama bankruptcy proceedings. The best professional approach involves recognizing that the historical development of bankruptcy law particularly the shift from a creditor-centric model to a more debtor-habilitative one, is directly reflected in the structure and purpose of the current U.S. Bankruptcy Code, which governs proceedings in Alabama. This understanding allows for a more nuanced application of the law, acknowledging the underlying policy goals that have been refined over centuries. For instance, understanding the historical evolution from early English statutes focused on punishing fraudulent debtors to modern U.S. law emphasizing a fresh start for honest but unfortunate debtors, provides a critical lens through which to interpret provisions related to discharge and exemptions in Alabama. This approach aligns with the ethical duty to provide competent representation, which includes a thorough understanding of the legal framework, both present and past, as it informs current legal interpretation and application. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the historical development of bankruptcy law as irrelevant to modern Alabama practice. This failure to appreciate the evolution of legal thought, such as the transition from purely punitive measures against debtors to rehabilitative goals, leads to a superficial understanding of the bankruptcy code. It risks misinterpreting the intent behind specific provisions, potentially advising clients in a manner that is not fully aligned with the spirit or letter of the law as it has been shaped by historical precedent. For example, focusing solely on the creditor's rights without acknowledging the historical development of debtor protections could lead to an overly aggressive litigation strategy that is ultimately counterproductive in a modern bankruptcy context. Another incorrect approach is to conflate the historical development of bankruptcy law in other jurisdictions or eras with the specific statutory framework applicable in Alabama. While historical influences are important, Alabama bankruptcy proceedings are governed by the U.S. Bankruptcy Code and federal court interpretations. Drawing direct parallels to, for example, ancient Roman insolvency laws or early colonial bankruptcy statutes, without considering the intervening centuries of legal development and the specific codification in the U.S., can lead to significant legal errors. This approach lacks the necessary precision and fails to ground advice in the operative legal framework. A third incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on the procedural aspects of bankruptcy filings without considering the underlying historical policy shifts. While procedural knowledge is vital, understanding the historical evolution of bankruptcy law provides insight into the why behind these procedures. For instance, understanding the historical struggle to balance creditor interests with the need for economic rehabilitation helps explain the complex rules surrounding claim priorities and the automatic stay. Ignoring this historical context can lead to a mechanical application of rules without a full appreciation of their purpose, potentially missing opportunities for creative problem-solving or failing to anticipate judicial interpretations rooted in these historical policy considerations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a commitment to continuous learning that extends beyond current statutes. Professionals should actively seek to understand the historical trajectory of the laws they practice, recognizing that foundational principles and policy shifts often inform contemporary legal interpretation. This involves consulting legislative history, seminal case law, and scholarly analyses that trace the evolution of bankruptcy law. When advising clients, this deeper understanding allows for more robust and insightful counsel, grounded in a comprehensive appreciation of the legal landscape. Question 16. System analysis indicates a debtor in Alabama has filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The debtor's estate includes a piece of equipment that is subject to a valid security interest held by creditor A. Additionally, the debtor owes outstanding wages to former employees, priority unsecured claim, and has a significant debt to a supplier for goods provided on open account, general unsecured claim. Professional overseeing the distribution of assets must determine the order in which these claims should be satisfied from the proceeds of the equipment sale. Which of the following approaches best reflects the legally mandated process for distributing these proceeds under Alabama bankruptcy law? Option A. Distribute the proceeds of the equipment sale proportionally among creditor A, the former employees, and the supplier based on the total amount of their respective claims. Option B. Prioritize the payment of outstanding wages to former employees first, followed by the supplier's open account debt, and then satisfy creditor A's secured claim with any remaining funds. Option C. Allocate the proceeds based on the order in which each creditor filed their claim with the bankruptcy court, ensuring that the earliest filed claims are paid first. Option D. First, satisfy the secured claim of creditor from the proceeds of the equipment. Then distribute any remaining proceeds to the former employees for their outstanding wages. And finally, distribute any residual amount to the supplier for the open account debt. The correct answer is D. First, satisfy the secured claim of creditor from the proceeds of the equipment, then distribute any remaining proceeds to the former employees for their outstanding wages, and finally, distribute any residual amount to the supplier for the open account debt. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in bankruptcy proceeding where a debtor's assets may be subject to competing claims, requiring careful navigation of the Alabama Bankruptcy Code and relevant case law. The professional challenge lies in accurately identifying the priority of claims and ensuring that the distribution of assets adheres strictly to statutory mandates, thereby protecting the integrity of the bankruptcy process and the rights of creditors. Misinterpreting these priorities can lead to significant legal repercussions, including sanctions and financial liability for the professional involved. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of the Alabama Bankruptcy Code, specifically focusing on the provisions governing secured claims, priority unsecured claims, and general unsecured claims. This approach necessitates understanding the definition of a secured claim under Alabama law, which typically involves a valid lien on specific property of the debtor. Priority unsecured claims, such as certain taxes and wages, are also explicitly defined and ranked by statute. General unsecured claims represent all other claims not falling into the secured or priority categories. A professional must meticulously analyze the nature of each claim presented, verify the existence and perfection of any alleged security interests, and then apply the statutory priority scheme to determine the order and extent of payment from the debtor's available assets. This systematic, legally grounded approach ensures compliance with the bankruptcy code and equitable treatment of creditors according to their legal standing. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that all claims presented by creditors are valid and entitled to payment in the order they are received. This fails to acknowledge the statutory framework that dictates priority based on the nature of the claim and any perfected security interests, bypasses the critical step of verifying lien validity and statutory priority, potentially leading to improper distributions and violations of the Alabama Bankruptcy Code. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize claims based on the creditor's relationship with the debtor or the perceived urgency of their need for payment, without regard to legal standing. This subjective method disregards the objective legal priorities established by the Bankruptcy Code, which are designed to ensure fairness and predictability in the distribution of assets. Such an approach would be a direct contravention of the statutory requirements. A further incorrect approach is to distribute assets solely based on the amount of debt owed, without differentiating between secured, priority unsecured, and general unsecured claims. While the amount of debt is a factor in determining the pro rata distribution within a class of unsecured creditors, it does not override the fundamental priority scheme established by law. This method ignores the legal distinctions that are paramount in bankruptcy distributions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in bankruptcy matters must adopt a rigorous, legally driven decision-making process. This begins with a comprehensive understanding of the applicable jurisdiction's bankruptcy laws, in this case, the Alabama Bankruptcy Code. When faced with competing claims, the professional must engage in a detailed factual investigation to ascertain the nature and validity of each claim. This involves reviewing documentation, verifying liens, and researching statutory provisions. The decision-making framework should then apply the established legal priorities systematically, ensuring that each distribution is justifiable under the law. Any deviation from this legally mandated process introduces unacceptable risk and undermines the integrity of the bankruptcy system. Question 17. The risk matrix shows that a debtor in Alabama, prior to filing for bankruptcy, transferred a valuable antique automobile to their brother. The debtor claims this was a personal gift and not a sale, considering the trustee's responsibilities in administering the bankruptcy estate under Alabama bankruptcy law. Which of the following represents the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for the trustee? Option A. Immediately dismiss the transfer as irrelevant to the bankruptcy estate because it was made to a family member, assuming such transfers are outside the trustee's purview. Option B. Investigate the circumstances of the transfer, including the timing, the value exchanged, and whether the transfer could be considered a fraudulent conveyance or preferential transfer under applicable bankruptcy and Alabama law, to determine if the automobile can be recovered for the bankruptcy estate. Option C. Accept the debtor's statement that the transfer was a gift and consider the matter closed, as personal gifts are generally not subject to recovery by the bankruptcy trustee. Option D. Advise the debtor that the transfer was improper and should be unwound by the debtor voluntarily, without the trustee taking any formal action to recover the asset. The correct answer is B. Investigate the circumstances of the transfer, including the timing, the value exchanged, and whether the transfer could be considered a fraudulent conveyance or preferential transfer under applicable bankruptcy and Alabama law, to determine if the automobile can be recovered for the bankruptcy estate. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential conflict of interest involving a debtor's pre-bankruptcy asset transfer. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a thorough understanding of Alabama bankruptcy law concerning the bankruptcy estate, specifically the trustee's power to avoid certain pre-petition transfers. The trustee has a fiduciary duty to maximize the value of the estate for the benefit of creditors, and failing to identify and pursue potentially avoidable transfers directly undermines this duty. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between legitimate transactions and those that may be deemed fraudulent or preferential. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive review of the debtor's financial history, including all pre-petition transfers of significant assets. This approach correctly identifies that the trustee must investigate whether the transfer of the antique automobile to the debtor's brother, occurring within the look-back period for fraudulent conveyances under Alabama law, and potentially for less than reasonably equivalent value, could be avoided and the asset recovered for the bankruptcy estate. This aligns with the trustee's statutory obligation under the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, as applied in Alabama, to gather all property that the debtor owned or had an interest in at the commencement of the case, including property that can be recovered through avoidance actions. The trustee's duty is to act in the best interest of the estate and its creditors, which necessitates pursuing all available legal remedies to preserve and augment estate assets. An incorrect approach would be to simply accept the debtor's assertion that the transfer was a legitimate gift without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge the trustee's duty to scrutinize all transactions for potential avoidance under bankruptcy law, particularly those that appear to diminish the debtor's assets shortly before filing. Such an approach risks violating the trustee's fiduciary responsibilities and could lead to sanctions or removal. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the transfer was to a family member, it is automatically valid and beyond the scope of the trustee's review. Alabama bankruptcy law, like federal bankruptcy law, provides mechanisms to address transfers to insiders or related parties that may be preferential or fraudulent, regardless of the familial relationship. Ignoring this possibility is a significant oversight. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to dismiss the transfer as irrelevant to the bankruptcy estate simply because the debtor claims it was a gift. The nature of the transfer and its timing are critical factors in determining whether it constitutes property of the estate or is subject to avoidance. The trustee must apply legal principles to the facts, not rely on the debtor's subjective characterization of the transaction. Professionals should employ a systematic approach to asset review in bankruptcy cases. This involves 1. Understanding the scope of the bankruptcy estate under the U.S. Bankruptcy Code and relevant state law, Alabama in this case. 2. Meticulously examining the debtor's financial records and pre-petition transactions for any indicators of potential avoidance actions, e.g., transfers for less than reasonably equivalent value, transfers to insiders, preferential payments. 3. Consulting relevant legal provisions regarding fraudulent conveyances and preferential transfers. And 4. Taking appropriate legal action to recover assets for the benefit of the estate, always prioritizing the fiduciary duty to creditors. Question 18. Governance review demonstrates that in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy case filed in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama, the debtor, Alabama Manufacturing LLC, has objected to a proof of claim filed by Southern Steel Inc. due to insufficient supporting documentation. Southern Steel Inc. subsequently provides additional invoices and contract excerpts. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the court to consider? Option A. Evaluate the sufficiency of the newly provided documentation to determine if it adequately substantiates the claim, and if so, allow the claim subject to any other valid objections. Option B. Allow the claim in full without further review, assuming the creditor's subsequent submissions are sufficient. Option C. Refer the matter for informal mediation between the debtor and creditor, bypassing formal court review of the documentation. Option D. Immediately disallow the claim because the initial proof of claim lacked sufficient documentation, regardless of subsequent submissions. The correct answer is A. Evaluate the sufficiency of the newly provided documentation to determine if it adequately substantiates the claim, and if so, allow the claim subject to any other valid objections. Explanation. Governance review demonstrates that a creditor, Southern Steel Inc., filed a proof of claim in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy case pending in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama. The debtor, Alabama Manufacturing LLC, objects to the claim, asserting that Southern Steel Inc. failed to provide adequate documentation to substantiate the amount claimed, specifically requesting invoices and supporting contracts. The challenge here lies in balancing the creditor's right to have their claim considered against the debtor's obligation to ensure the accuracy and validity of claims against the estate, all within the framework of the Alabama Bankruptcy Law. The best professional approach involves diligently reviewing the objection and the creditor's response within the established procedural rules of the Bankruptcy Court for the Northern District of Alabama. This includes assessing whether the debtor's objection is specific and well-founded, and whether Southern Steel Inc. has been afforded a reasonable opportunity to cure any deficiencies in its documentation. If the creditor provides sufficient supplementary documentation that cures the initial defects, the claim should be allowed, subject to further review if other grounds for objection exist. This aligns with the principles of due process and the Bankruptcy Code's intent to allow valid claims while preventing fraudulent or unsubstantiated ones. An incorrect approach would be to summarily disallow the claim solely based on the initial lack of documentation, without considering any subsequent submissions or the reasonableness of the debtor's objection. This fails to provide the creditor with adequate notice and an opportunity to be heard, violating fundamental bankruptcy principles. Another unacceptable approach is to allow the claim without any further scrutiny, even if the debtor's objection highlights significant evidentiary gaps that remain unaddressed by the creditor. This undermines the debtor's ability to manage the estate effectively and could lead to the payment of invalid debts. Finally, attempting to resolve the dispute through informal discussions outside the court's established procedures, without filing appropriate pleadings or seeking court intervention, bypasses the necessary legal safeguards and could result in an unenforceable resolution. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific allegations in the objection and the creditor's response. They must then consult the relevant sections of the United States Bankruptcy Code and the Federal Rules of Bankruptcy Procedure, as applied in the Northern District of Alabama, to determine the procedural requirements for objections to claims and the standards for allowance. A thorough review of the evidence presented by both parties, coupled with an assessment of whether procedural fairness has been maintained, is crucial for making a sound and legally defensible decision. Question 19. Quality control measures reveal that a bankruptcy attorney in Alabama, representing a debtor in a Chapter 7 proceeding, failed to list a valuable piece of inherited real estate on the initial bankruptcy petition and schedules. The attorney recently learned of this inheritance from the client, who expressed concern about its impact on the bankruptcy. What is the most appropriate and ethically sound course of action for the attorney to take? Option A. Inform the client that the real estate will be disclosed only if it becomes necessary to sell it to satisfy creditor claims. Option B. Advise the client to keep the inherited real estate undisclosed and hope it is not discovered by the trustee or creditors. Option C. Suggest the client attempt to informally resolve the matter with the bankruptcy trustee without formally amending the petition. Option D. Immediately file an amended Schedule, a /B and Statement of Financial Affairs, to accurately disclose the inherited real estate and consult with the client regarding its implications for the bankruptcy estate. The correct answer is D. Immediately file an amended Schedule, a /B and Statement of Financial Affairs, to accurately disclose the inherited real estate and consult with the client regarding its implications for the bankruptcy estate. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a bankruptcy attorney in Alabama to balance the duty of zealous representation with the ethical obligation to ensure the accuracy and completeness of court filings. The attorney must navigate the potential for inadvertent omission versus intentional misrepresentation, and the consequences of either can be severe for the client and the attorney. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate course of action when a significant asset is discovered after the initial petition has been filed. The best professional approach involves immediately amending the bankruptcy petition to include the newly discovered asset. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the omission in the most transparent and compliant manner. Under the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, specifically Rule 1007 of the Federal Rules of Bankruptcy Procedure, debtors are required to file schedules of assets and liabilities. Failure to disclose assets can lead to serious consequences, including denial of discharge, dismissal of the case, and potential criminal charges for fraud. By promptly filing an amended schedule, the attorney ensures the court and creditors have accurate information, fulfilling the duty of candor owed to the court, and upholding the integrity of the bankruptcy process in Alabama. This proactive measure demonstrates good faith and minimizes potential prejudice to creditors. An incorrect approach would be to advise the client to hold onto the asset and not disclose it, hoping it goes unnoticed. This is ethically and legally unacceptable. It constitutes a direct violation of the debtor's duty to disclose all assets under the Bankruptcy Code and potentially constitutes bankruptcy fraud. Such an action undermines the fundamental principles of bankruptcy law, which rely on full and honest disclosure. Another incorrect approach would be to wait until the asset is needed to pay creditors before disclosing it. While this might seem like a way to avoid immediate complications, it still represents a failure to disclose at the earliest possible opportunity. The Bankruptcy Code requires timely disclosure, and delaying disclosure, even with the intention of eventual revelation, can be viewed as an attempt to mislead or prejudice creditors. This approach fails to uphold the duty of candor to the court and can lead to sanctions. A further incorrect approach would be to attempt to informally resolve the issue with the trustee without amending the petition. While communication with the trustee is important, it cannot substitute for the formal requirement of amending the bankruptcy schedules. The trustee needs official documentation to administer the asset properly, and informal discussions do not satisfy the legal obligation to update the court record. This approach risks miscommunication and can lead to the trustee taking action based on incomplete information, potentially harming the client's case. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the Bankruptcy Code and Federal Rules of Bankruptcy Procedure, particularly those pertaining to disclosure requirements. When an omission is discovered, the attorney must assess the nature and significance of the omitted item. The immediate and paramount step is to rectify the omission through the proper procedural channels, which in this case is filing an amended petition. This ensures compliance, protects the client from potential penalties, and maintains the attorney's ethical standing. Question 20. In Alabama, a sole proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, is considering filing for bankruptcy. He owns a home with a fair market value of $250,000 and an outstanding mortgage of $180,000. His business, Abernathy's Appliances, has inventory valued at $40,000 and equipment with a liquidation value of $15,000. Also has a business loan of $25,000 secured by the inventory and equipment. Mr. Abernathy wants to retain his home and minimize the impact on his business. He asks you, as his attorney, to calculate the total equity he has in his personal residence and his business assets, and to advise him on the most advantageous bankruptcy filing strategy. Which approach would be most appropriate for determining Mr. Abernathy's total equity and guiding his bankruptcy strategy? Option A. Calculate the equity in the home as the fair market value minus the mortgage, $250,000, $180,000 equals $70,000. Calculate the business equity by subtracting the business loan from the combined value of inventory and equipment, $40,000 plus $15,000. $25,000 equals $30,000. The total equity is the sum of personal and business equity, $70,000 plus $30,000 equals $100,000. This total equity figure, along with an analysis of Alabama's exemption laws and the debtor's ability to repay debts, will inform the recommendation for either a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 filing. Option B. Advise Mr. Abernathy that business assets are not considered in individual bankruptcy filings, and therefore only the equity in his home should be calculated and disclosed. Option C. Focus solely on the equity in the home, as it is a personal asset, and disregard the business assets and liabilities for the purpose of calculating total equity, as they belong to the business entity. Option D. Value the business inventory and equipment at their book value as per Mr. Abernathy's accounting records and subtract the business loan. Then add this to the home equity calculated by subtracting only the principal portion of the mortgage payments. The correct answer is A. Calculate the equity in the home as the fair market value minus the mortgage, $250, $000, $180, $000 equals $70, $000. Calculate the business equity by subtracting the business loan from the combined value of inventory and equipment, $40, $000 plus $15, $000, $25, $000 equals $30, $000. The total equity is the sum of personal and business equity, $70, $000 plus $30, $000 equals $100, $000. This total equity figure, along with an analysis of Alabama's exemption laws and the debtor's ability to repay debts, will inform the recommendation for either a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 filing. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the conflicting interests of a debtor seeking to preserve assets and the potential for creditors to be disadvantaged. The core issue revolves around accurately valuing assets for bankruptcy proceedings under Alabama law, specifically distinguishing between individual and business bankruptcy implications. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the Bankruptcy Code and Alabama-specific statutes, maintaining ethical obligations to both the client and the court. The best approach involves a thorough and objective valuation of all assets, distinguishing between those that are personal property of the debtor and those that constitute business assets. This requires employing recognized appraisal methods and potentially engaging third-party experts, as mandated by the Bankruptcy Code, e.g., 11 U.S.C. Section 506 for valuation of secured claims, and Rule 1001 of the Federal Rules of Bankruptcy Procedure for general procedural rules. For instance, if the debtor operates a sole proprietorship, business inventory and equipment would be distinct from personal household goods. The calculation of the debtor's equity in secured assets, such as a home or vehicle, is crucial. For a home, this would involve subtracting the outstanding mortgage balance from the fair market value. If the debtor owns a business, the valuation of business assets would be critical for determining the liquidation value versus the going concern value, which impacts the type of bankruptcy filed and the distribution to creditors. For example, if a debtor has a business with equipment valued at $50, $000 and an outstanding loan of $20, $000, the equity is $30, $000. This equity, along with other assets, will determine the feasibility of a Chapter 7 liquidation or a Chapter 13 reorganization. The formula for equity in an asset is equity equals fair market value secured debt. An incorrect approach would be to selectively value only those assets that would benefit the debtor, ignoring or undervaluing assets that would be subject to liquidation for creditors. This violates the debtor's duty to disclose all assets and the trustee's duty to liquidate non-exempt property for the benefit of creditors under 11 U.S.C. Section 704. For example, failing to disclose a valuable piece of business equipment or significantly undervaluing it would be a misrepresentation. Another incorrect approach would be to commingle personal and business assets without clear delineation, making it impossible to determine which assets are subject to business creditors versus personal creditors, or which are exempt under Alabama law. This lack of clarity can lead to disputes and potential sanctions for the debtor and their counsel. For instance, if a debtor uses a business account for personal expenses without proper accounting, it becomes difficult to trace and value both business and personal assets accurately. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the debtor's subjective estimation of asset values, without independent verification. While the debtor's knowledge is important, the Bankruptcy Code requires objective valuations, especially for significant assets, to ensure fairness to all parties. For example, if a debtor claims their business is worth only $10,000 when market comparables suggest a much higher value, this discrepancy needs to be addressed through professional appraisal. The professional decision-making process should involve 1. Understanding the client's financial situation and goals. 2. Identifying all potential assets, both personal and business. 3. Applying appropriate valuation methodologies, potentially using expert appraisers. 4. Clearly distinguishing between personal and business assets and their respective liabilities. 5. Calculating equity in secured assets using the formula: equity equals fair market value secured debt. 6. Ensuring full disclosure to the court and trustee and compliance with all applicable provisions of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code and Alabama law.